What if the most powerful rulers in human history were not entirely human? For thousands of years, we've been told that the pharaohs of Egypt were men. Extraordinary men, but men nonetheless. But buried beneath centuries of sand, stone, and silence lies a different story. A story the ancient priests encoded in their temples. A story the first historians refused to write down. A story that connects the god-kings of Egypt to a bloodline that existed before the Great Flood. In the Bible, and in the ancient forbidden book of Enoch, they are called the Nephilim, the offspring of divine beings and human women, giants who walked the earth, possessors of forbidden knowledge. History tells us they were destroyed, wiped out by the flood, erased from the earth. But what if that's exactly what someone wanted you to believe? What if the bloodline survived? What if it didn't vanish beneath the waters, but instead rose to power in the deserts of North Africa? What if the first pharaohs, those semi-divine rulers who built monuments we still cannot fully explain, were the direct descendants of the Nephilim? This is not a fringe theory whispered in dark corners. The evidence is carved in stone, written in fire, hidden in plain sight. And today, we're going to uncover it. To understand the pharaohs, we must first understand what came before them. Long before Narmer unified Egypt, long before the first pyramid rose from the sand, ancient Egyptian tradition speaks of a time called Zep Tepi, the first time, an age when gods walked among men and ruled the earth directly. These divine rulers were known as the Netjeru, the gods. But they were not distant, invisible deities. They were physical beings, present, powerful, flesh and will. The Turin King List, one of the most complete ancient Egyptian records ever found, lists these divine rulers before the human pharaohs. Thousands of years of reign, individual rulers governing for centuries at a time, numbers that defy human biology entirely. Mainstream historians call it mythology, symbolic exaggeration, but is it, or does it mirror something else? Something from a different ancient text? Open the book of Genesis. Chapter 5. The genealogy of the patriarchs before the flood. Methuselah, 969 years. Adam, 930 years. Jared, 962 years. These are not metaphors in the text. These are presented as literal lifespans. Now compare that to the Sumerian king list, discovered in Mesopotamia, the same region where the Nephilim tradition originates. Kings ruling for 28,000 years, 36,000 years. Numbers so extreme they were dismissed as fiction for centuries. 3 separate ancient civilizations, 3 separate traditions, all describing the same phenomenon, rulers who lived and reigned far beyond human limits. This is not coincidence. This is convergence. And convergence, in ancient studies, is the closest thing we have to proof. Now let's go deeper. The Book of Enoch, written centuries before the New Testament, quoted directly by the Apostle Jude, describes the Watchers, divine beings who descended to earth on a mountain called Hermon, who took human wives, who produced offspring of extraordinary size and power. These offspring, the Nephilim, were more than just large. They were repositories of forbidden knowledge: astronomy, architecture, metallurgy, medicine. Sound familiar? Because those are precisely the areas where ancient Egypt demonstrated knowledge that defies the supposed technological level of their era. The Great Pyramid of Giza, aligned to true north with an accuracy of 0 or 5 degrees. Built with 3 million stone blocks, some weighing 80 tons. Engineers today, with modern machinery and computers, struggle to replicate what was supposedly built by men with copper tools and wooden sleds. But what if the builders weren't just men? What if they carried within them the encoded knowledge of a lineage that predated the flood? Consider the Sphinx. The Great Sphinx of Giza stares east toward the rising sun, with an expression that is neither fully human nor entirely animal. Geologists have noted something extraordinary. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx's enclosure suggest exposure to prolonged heavy rainfall, the kind of rainfall that last occurred in that region around 10,000 BC, thousands of years before the accepted construction date. If the Sphinx is older than we think, then so is the civilization that built it. And if that civilization predates the accepted timeline by thousands of years, then something is fundamentally wrong with the story we've been told. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Egyptian texts describe the pharaohs not merely as rulers appointed by the gods, but as beings who carried divine blood in their veins. The pharaoh was called the son of Ra, the living Horus, the earthly manifestation of divine power. But this wasn't just religious propaganda. Ancient Egyptian priests maintained detailed genealogical records tracing the royal bloodline back to the divine rulers of Zep-Tepi, back to the first time, back to beings who were not born of woman alone. Now consider this. Physical anomalies have been documented in several royal mummies recovered from Egyptian tombs. Elongated skulls, unusual bone density, skeletal proportions that fall outside normal human ranges. In 1907, the mummy of Ramesses II was examined by French scientists. His height was estimated at over 187 meters, extraordinarily tall for his era. But it was the examination of earlier pharaohs, those of the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, that produced the most unusual findings. Skulls with cranial volumes significantly larger than the average human population. Bone structures suggesting physical capabilities beyond the norm. Were these simply genetic anomalies? Random mutations in an isolated royal family? Or were they the fading echoes of a bloodline that once burned far brighter? The ancient Egyptians themselves seem to believe the latter. Their art consistently depicts the earliest divine rulers as towering figures, heads and shoulders above ordinary humans. And this brings us to one of the most controversial discoveries in the history of Egyptology. In the early 20th century, excavations near Saqqara uncovered a series of pre-dynastic burial sites unlike anything seen before. The remains found there were larger, the grave goods were more sophisticated, and the burial practices matched descriptions from texts that were supposedly written thousands of years later, as if whoever was buried there already possessed knowledge that wouldn't be invented for millennia. These findings were quietly cataloged, filed away. The official reports were vague. The remains were not displayed in museums. Why? What were the authorities of Egyptology so reluctant to show the world? Perhaps because the answer would force a complete rewriting of human history. Perhaps because some truths are considered too destabilizing to release. Or perhaps because the implications point directly to something the ancient Egyptians encoded in their most sacred texts. That the first rulers of Egypt were not born the way we are born. That their power was not merely political. That their blood carried something ancient, something divine, something other. The Nephilim did not disappear after the flood. They adapted, they migrated, they rebuilt, and in the fertile land between the Nile and the desert, they constructed the most enduring civilization the world has ever known. A civilization built not on sand, but on blood, on memory, on the encoded legacy of beings who once stood between heaven and earth. Egypt did not evolve slowly the way other civilizations did. It exploded. Around 3100 BC, in what historians call the early dynastic period, a fully formed civilization appeared in the Nile Valley with monumental architecture, a complex writing system, advanced mathematics, sophisticated medicine, and a centralized government. No gradual development, no primitive trial period, just sudden, overwhelming sophistication. Mainstream archaeology calls this the Egyptian miracle. But miracles, by definition, have no natural explanation. So let's look for an unnatural one. The first pharaoh of unified Egypt was Narmer. But Egyptian tradition insists that before Narmer there were others, divine rulers, semi-human kings who governed for impossible spans of time. The Palermo Stone, one of Egypt's oldest historical records, lists pre-dynastic rulers going back to a time before writing itself. These rulers are described differently from later pharaohs. They are taller, their reigns are longer, their powers are described in terms that blur the line between human and divine. This matches perfectly with what the Book of Enoch tells us about the Nephilim and their descendants, the Gibborim, mighty ones, heroes of old, men of renown. But the connection goes deeper than just long lifespans and unusual size. Ancient Egyptian religious texts, specifically the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings ever discovered, contain passages that describe the pharaoh's soul ascending to join the stars. Not metaphorically, literally. The texts describe precise stellar alignments, specific constellations, and a journey through the cosmos that reads less like poetry and more like navigation. Who taught the ancient Egyptians celestial navigation? Who gave them the astronomical knowledge encoded in the pyramid texts thousands of years before modern astronomy? According to the Book of Enoch, it was the Watchers, the divine beings who descended to earth and transferred forbidden knowledge to their offspring. Astronomy was specifically listed, along with the movements of the stars, the signs of the earth, and the knowledge of the clouds. The pyramid texts don't just describe a pharaoh's afterlife journey, they describe a return, a going back to something, a reunion with an origin point that was not Earth. Could this be the encoded memory of a bloodline that knew, on some deep ancestral level, that part of its origin lay beyond the human world? Now let's talk about the physical evidence, because this is where the story gets truly uncomfortable for mainstream science. In 2010, a team of researchers conducted DNA analysis on several royal mummies from the New Kingdom period. The results were published, then quietly walked back, then disputed, then buried in academic journals most people will never read. Why? Because the genetic markers found in certain royal mummies did not match the expected North African population of the time. Some markers suggested origins that were geographically impossible for the period. Genetic sequences that appeared in populations thousands of miles away and thousands of years later. Now, DNA analysis of ancient mummies is notoriously difficult. Contamination is a real issue. These results must be treated carefully, but they are not alone. They form part of a growing body of anomalous evidence that keeps pointing in the same direction. Consider the skull of Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh who attempted to dismantle the entire Egyptian religious system and replace it with worship of a single solar deity. His mummy has never been conclusively identified, but artistic depictions of Akhenaten show a figure with striking physical anomalies: an elongated skull, an unusually long face and neck, a body with feminine curves despite being male, limbs that appear disproportionately long. His children, depicted in royal art, show similar features: elongated heads, unusual proportions. Egyptologists explain this as artistic convention, a deliberate stylistic choice. But no other pharaoh before or after Akhenaten was depicted this way. Why would a stylistic choice be applied only to one family, unless that family actually looked different? And then there's the matter of Akhenaten's religious revolution itself. He didn't just change the gods. He claimed direct personal access to the divine. He positioned himself as the sole intermediary between humanity and the Aten, the solar disk. This is not the behavior of a man who believes he is simply appointed by the gods. This is the behavior of a being who believes he is divine, who carries divinity in his physical body. Could Akhenaten have been one of the last pharaohs in whom the Nephilim bloodline ran strong enough to be visible? Strong enough to alter his theology, his appearance, and his entire conception of reality? The priests who dismantled his legacy after his death seemed to think he was dangerous. They erased his name from monuments. They destroyed his city. They struck him from the official king lists. You don't erase a man that thoroughly unless what he represented threatened something fundamental. But Akhenaten is just one data point in a much larger pattern. Let's zoom out. Across Egypt's 3,000-year history, the royal bloodline was protected with extraordinary obsession. Pharaohs married their sisters, their daughters, their closest relatives. This wasn't merely political. It wasn't just about keeping power within the family. The ancient Egyptians believed, with absolute conviction, that the divine blood of the pharaoh had to be preserved in its purest form. Diluted too much, and the connection to the divine would be lost. The pharaoh would become merely human, and a merely human pharaoh could not fulfill his cosmic function. What cosmic function? According to Egyptian theology, the pharaoh was the living link between the human world and the divine order. Without him, without his specific blood, the universe itself would fall into chaos. This is an extraordinary claim to make about a political leader, unless the claim was originally true. Unless the first pharaohs really did carry something in their blood that later rulers were desperately trying to preserve. A genetic inheritance, a biological legacy. The diminishing but never quite extinguished flame of the Nephilim bloodline. And as Egypt's power grew, as the centuries passed and the bloodline was inevitably diluted through conquest and politics and time, that flame grew dimmer. The monuments became less precise. The knowledge became more ritualistic and less functional. The connection to Zep Tepi, the first time, became mythology rather than memory. Until finally, the last of the ancient bloodline sat on the throne of Egypt. A woman, a ruler of extraordinary intelligence and political genius. The last of a line that stretched back to the very dawn of human civilization. Her name was Cleopatra, and when she died, something ancient died with her. But not everything was lost, because bloodlines don't simply end. They scatter, they hide, they flow into new vessels and new lands. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC, he did something no conqueror before him had done. He went immediately to the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis. He went alone. He emerged hours later, shaken and transformed. He never revealed what the oracle told him, but from that moment forward, Alexander declared himself the son of Amun, the son of God. He adopted Egyptian royal titles. He demanded to be worshipped as divine. Was this mere political strategy? Or had the oracle revealed something to Alexander about his own origins, something that connected him to the ancient bloodline of the pharaohs? Alexander's physical description is worth noting. Ancient sources describe him as unusually powerful for his size, with eyes of different colors, one blue, one dark brown, a condition called heterochromia. His hair was described as leonine, thick, wild, almost uncontrollable. He reportedly had a slightly elongated neck and held his head at a distinctive tilt. Small details, but details that keep appearing in descriptions of figures who carry what the ancients called divine blood. When Alexander died at 32, under circumstances that remain deeply mysterious, his generals divided his empire. Egypt went to Ptolemy, one of his closest companions. And Ptolemy did something extraordinary. He didn't just rule Egypt, he absorbed it. He adopted its religion, its royal titles, its theological system. He connected his bloodline, through careful political mythology, directly to the ancient pharaonic line. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed maintained this connection for nearly 3 centuries. They spoke Egyptian. They worshipped Egyptian gods. They perpetuated the tradition of divine kingship with an almost desperate insistence, as if they knew what that tradition protected, as if they understood that the theology was not merely symbolic but encoded something real. And then came Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, fluent in 9 languages, a student of philosophy, astronomy, and what ancient sources describe as the secret knowledge of the temples. Cleopatra did not merely rule Egypt. She claimed to be the living goddess Isis. She performed the ancient rituals. She accessed the inner sanctums of temples that had been closed for generations. What was she looking for in those temples? What knowledge was she trying to recover or preserve? When Rome finally conquered Egypt after her death, the first thing the Romans did was seal the inner chambers of the major temples. Access to certain texts was restricted to imperial authorities only. Julius Caesar, who famously became Cleopatra's lover, spent considerable time in the library of Alexandria before it was burned. Ancient sources suggest he had copies made of specific texts before the fire. What texts? On whose orders? And where did those copies go? These questions lead us into territory that mainstream history refuses to map. But the trail of evidence doesn't stop at the borders of Egypt. Because the same bloodline markers, the physical anomalies, the claims of divine origin, the impossible knowledge, begin appearing in other cultures shortly after Egypt's decline. In Mesoamerica, the earliest ruling classes of the Olmec civilization appear suddenly, with no clear developmental period, claiming descent from sky beings. Their monuments depict figures with elongated skulls. In South America, The Inca royal family maintained that they were the direct children of the sun god Inti and enforced strict bloodline purity through sibling marriage, exactly as the Egyptian pharaohs had done. In ancient China, the earliest imperial dynasties claimed descent from the dragon kings, divine beings who had come from the heavens and given humanity the gifts of writing, agriculture, and civilization. In ancient India, the Vedic texts described the Devas and Asuras, divine beings who interacted directly with human rulers, producing hybrid lineages of extraordinary power and knowledge. In ancient Sumeria, the very civilization that produced the Nephilim tradition, the king list describes rulers of impossible longevity who governed before the Great Deluge. Rulers who were described as part divine, part human, who built the first cities, who established the first laws. The same story, different languages, different continents. The same core claim, that the ruling bloodline was not entirely human, that it carried something inherited from divine beings who walked the earth before recorded history. Are we really supposed to believe that all of these civilizations independently invented the same mythology, the same physical descriptions, the same obsessive bloodline preservation? Or is it more likely that they all inherited, directly or indirectly, the same truth? Medieval European royalty maintained an obsession with bloodline purity that mirrors the Egyptian royal tradition almost exactly. The divine right of kings, the theological claim that royal authority derived directly from God, was not merely political ideology. It was a survival of the ancient belief that certain bloodlines carried a literal divine inheritance. That kingship was not a human institution but a cosmic one. The Holy Roman Empire, the French monarchy, the British royal family, all maintained genealogical records stretching back into the mists of history. All claimed, in one form or another, descent from divine or semi-divine ancestors. British royal genealogy, officially maintained, traces the lineage back through the medieval kings, through the Roman emperors, through ancient Mesopotamian rulers, back ultimately to figures who predate recorded history, figures whose lifespans in the genealogical records stretch to centuries. Back, if you follow the thread far enough, to the same pre-flood patriarchs described in Genesis. The same era the Book of Enoch places the Nephilim. This is not conspiracy theory. These genealogies are publicly available. They are maintained by official royal archivists. The connection is there for anyone willing to trace it. The question is not whether the bloodline was preserved. The evidence suggests it was, across thousands of years and multiple civilizations. The question is, what does it mean? What is actually being preserved? What is it about this particular lineage that made civilization after civilization fight to maintain its purity? In 1901, a French archaeologist named Jacques de Morgan made a discovery in the royal tombs of Abydos that should have changed everything we know about ancient Egypt. He found inscriptions, pre-dynastic inscriptions, older than the first pharaoh, that described a lineage of rulers stretching back to what the Egyptians called the time of the Negeru, the time of the gods, the first time, Zep Tepi. The inscriptions were translated, catalogued, and filed. They received a brief mention in an obscure academic journal, and then effectively, they disappeared from mainstream discourse. This is a pattern we've seen throughout this entire investigation. Evidence surfaces. It creates problems for the established narrative, and it quietly vanishes into the archives. But patterns once seen cannot be unseen, and the pattern of deliberate suppression is itself a form of evidence. Why suppress information about the origins of the pharaohs unless those origins reveal something that someone, somewhere, considers dangerous to reveal? If the Nephilim bloodline is real, if divine beings did interbreed with humans before the flood, producing offspring of extraordinary capability, then the implications are staggering. It would mean that human civilization was not an independent achievement, that our greatest monuments, our earliest religious systems, our first written languages, all of it was seeded by beings whose origins lay beyond the human world. It would mean that the division between human and divine is not absolute, that it has been bridged before, and that the bridge was biological. It would mean that certain human beings carry, in their DNA, a legacy that connects them to something older and stranger than anything our history books acknowledge. Now, modern genetics has made discoveries in the last 2 decades that are quietly revolutionizing our understanding of human origins. In 2010, scientists sequencing the Neanderthal genome discovered something unexpected. Modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA, between 1% and 4% in most non-African populations. We didn't just coexist with Neanderthals, we interbred with them, and we carry the biological legacy of that interbreeding to this day. In 2018, researchers announced the discovery of the Denisovans, another archaic human species, known only from a finger bone and a few teeth found in a Siberian cave. And yet, Denisovan DNA has been found in modern human populations across Asia and Oceania. Another ancient interbreeding event, another inherited biological legacy. Science has now confirmed what was once considered impossible, that modern humans are hybrids, that we carry within us the DNA of beings who were not fully human in the way we define humanity today. Is it so impossible, then, given this confirmed pattern of ancient interbreeding, that another event of this kind might have occurred? One involving beings whose biological capabilities exceeded even those of archaic humans? The Book of Enoch does not describe the Watchers as aliens in the modern science fiction sense. It describes them as a different order of being, one that existed alongside humanity but operated at a different level of power and knowledge. If such beings existed, if they left biological descendants among the human population, we would expect to find exactly what we do find: anomalous physical characteristics in ancient ruling classes, impossible knowledge encoded in early civilizations, and an obsessive multi-millennial effort to preserve specific bloodlines. The evidence for all 3 of these things is overwhelming. The question is only whether we are willing to follow it to its logical conclusion. In ancient Egypt, the bloodline was preserved through the pharaonic institution. In ancient China, through the imperial dynasties. In Mesoamerica, through the divine origin ruling classes of the Olmec, Maya, and Inca. In medieval Europe, through the doctrine of divine right. Through the obsessive genealogical record-keeping of royal houses. Through the preservation of specific bloodlines across centuries of war, plague, and political upheaval. And today, the ancient royal bloodlines have not disappeared. They have transformed. They have adapted. They have moved from the visible thrones of kingdoms to the less visible, but no less powerful structures of modern influence. The same families whose genealogies trace back to medieval kings, and through them to ancient emperors, and through them to prehistoric patriarchs, continue to exercise disproportionate influence over the institutions that shape human civilization. This is not paranoia. This is genealogy. It is documented. It is traceable, and it raises a question that no serious researcher can dismiss. Is the preservation of these bloodlines merely a human obsession with legacy and power? Or is something else being maintained, something biological, something that connects certain living human beings to an inheritance that predates recorded history? We cannot answer that question with certainty. The full truth, if it exists in recoverable form, lies buried in archives that are not open to the public, in chambers that have not been excavated, in DNA that has not yet been sequenced. But we can say this: the evidence accumulated across this entire investigation is not the product of coincidence or wishful thinking. The Turin King list, the Book of Enoch, the pyramid texts, the physical anomalies of the royal mummies, the sudden appearance of advanced civilization, the universal myth of divine kingship, the obsessive preservation of specific bloodlines across thousands of years and dozens of cultures. Taken individually, each piece of evidence can be explained away. Mythology, coincidence, artistic convention, genetic anomaly. But taken together, as a unified pattern, they point toward a single conclusion: that the pharaohs of ancient Egypt were not simply extraordinary men, that they were the custodians of a biological legacy that connected the human world to something older, stranger, and far more powerful. That the Nephilim, or whatever we choose to call the beings described in the ancient texts, left more than myths behind. They left blood, and blood as the ancient Egyptians knew better than anyone, does not lie. The stones of Giza still stand. The texts of Enoch still speak. The bones in the museum cases still carry their silent secrets. The hieroglyphs carved into temple walls that no tourist ever reads. The sealed chambers beneath the Sphinx that no archaeologist has officially entered. The restricted archives of the Vatican Library where ancient Egyptian manuscripts sit in climate-controlled darkness, unread by the public for centuries. What do they contain? What truths are being kept from us? Not through malice necessarily, but through the deep institutional reluctance of established science to confront conclusions it cannot control. Because that is the real mystery here, not just what the pharaohs were, but why the truth about what they were has been so carefully, so consistently, so thoroughly buried. Every civilization that inherited the bloodline also inherited the silence around it. The Egyptians encoded it in mythology. The Greeks wrapped it in allegory. The Romans locked it in imperial archives. The medieval church reframed it as heresy. And modern academia dismisses it as pseudoscience, layer after layer of concealment, each era adding its own form of suppression. Each institution finding its own way to ensure that the question is never asked too loudly, never investigated too seriously, never followed to its ultimate conclusion. And yet here we are, asking the question, following the evidence, because the pattern is too consistent, the convergence is too precise, the suppression is too deliberate. Somewhere in the unbroken chain of human generations, across every continent, in every culture, in every era, the thread of that ancient bloodline continues, carried in the DNA of people who may have no idea what they carry, expressed in capabilities and characteristics that medicine classifies as anomaly and history calls coincidence. The children of the Nephilim did not vanish. They became kings. They became pharaohs. They became emperors and conquerors, and the founders of dynasties that shaped the entire trajectory of human civilization. And when the age of kings ended, they didn't disappear. They simply changed their titles. Whether that bloodline ends with the modern world, or whether it is still being deliberately preserved by those who know exactly what it means, that is a question only the keepers of the oldest archives can answer. And they are not talking. Not yet.